Hello, this is Dr. Richard Olivas, and this lecture is titled Moving West, Slavery's Expansion and Civil War. If you knew nothing else about the coming of the American Civil War, other than what you see on your screen, you would be correct to say westward movement led to the expansion of slavery, which in turn led to the Civil War. A good three-point outline. But you would need to fill it in. But that's the main idea that we're trying to convey. In pursuit of manifest destiny, our thesis statement says, the United States, the nation, gained vast natural wealth, but moving west and acquiring new territories fueled the controversy over slavery's future. Events after 1850 outran the nation's ability to compromise, and civil war began. First, we need to take a look at the area west of the Mississippi River, sometimes called the Trans-Mississippi West. Trans meaning across. So it's the western United States across, the United States west or across the Mississippi. The size of the migration. On this map, the Trans-Mississippi West would be the area in the white all the way over to the Pacific Ocean. Now, between 1815 and 1840, Americans, for the most part, settled the area east of the Mississippi River, the brown area on the map, especially the area between the Mississippi River and the Appalachian Mountains. But by 1860, nearly 4.3 million Americans had moved west of the Mississippi, meaning the area that's white, blue, pink, and gold on your map. In 1815, Spain held title to most of the Trans-Mississippi region. But after 1821, most of those lands belonged to Mexico. The United States and Great Britain jointly occupied the Oregon Territory in the gold. In the 1840s and 1850s, the United States gained possession of the West through the Mexican War, the Oregon Treaty, and the Gadsden Purchase. We'll come back to talk about all of those. What was Manifest Destiny? Manifest Destiny, excuse me, was the conviction or the belief that superior culture and institutions gave Americans a God-given right and even an obligation to spread American civilization across the continent, all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. This sense of mission, a legacy of Puritan utopianism, as well as revolutionary republicanism, combined with the absorption of Louisiana, rapid population growth, and advances in transportation, communication, and industry, created an argument for territorial expansion. You can see in this painting called American Progress, you can see the thrust of westward movement all the way to the right. Excuse me. You can see Manhattan Island in New York and the Brooklyn Bridge. And then you can see the different phases of American westward movement. You can see a solitary horse rider, a stagecoach, a Conestoga wagon, and then of course the yeoman farmer plowing his field. You can see prospectors on the bottom coming. And then up floating above the landscape is Columbia, a symbol of America with the Star of Empire on her forehead. In her right hand, she holds a book symbolizing knowledge. And then in the right hand is coiled, around her right elbow is coiled wire, which with the left hand she is stringing along the telegraph line, the telegraph poles. And as you know, the telegraph was the internet of the 19th century, because once the telegraph was completed, you could send coded messages across vast distances in a very short amount of time. Train schedules, financial reports, news of military advancement, things like that. And then you can see the mountains there. And as she floats over the landscape, she sheds light on the earth below, and receding into the wilderness are the primitive so-called elements. You can see Indians, you can see the buffalo, wolves, as American progress moves. This painting, by the way, is held at the Autry Museum of the American West in Griffith Park here in Los Angeles. But it symbolizes what we call manifest destiny. That the destiny, what was meant to be is becoming manifest or clear. And what's clear, Americans believed, was that it was their obligation to create a continental republic. As you recall early on from the semester, Americans at one time were fearful and cautious about having a republic that was too large geographically. But now many Americans support the idea of having a republic that goes from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific. And many people feel that it is their solemn duty to spread American civilization across the continent. Point 2, gaining ground in the Trans-Mississippi West. Manifest destiny did not cause westward expansion, contrary to what many people think. But it certainly justified it. It was a way that people explained how everything seemed to be breaking our way, that everything seemed to be providentially or even almost foreordained, perhaps by God, that the United States become a continental republic. What really caused westward expansion were events in Texas that made US expansion possible into the northern part of Mexico. Manifest destiny justified, but did not cause westward expansion. As we said, events in Texas made possible US expansion into the northern part of Mexico. So let us look then at Texas annexation. To annex something means to bring it in. So let's talk about how Texas became part of the United States. Now, as we said, Mexico became a country in 1821. All the area in the sort of the orange at one time was part of the Spanish Empire called New Spain. And the geographical center, the population center of New Spain was in its southern part near what is today Mexico City. So the area inside that red oval there on your screen was a mission frontier. It was sometimes called the northern borderlands, but there weren't heavy population centers there. But in 1821, New Spain became Mexico because Mexico became a country in 1821. And Mexico wisely recognized that it needed to strengthen its northern borderlands. So in 1823, Mexico attempted to strengthen its northern boundaries inside this red area, more or less, to increase population in that area and to attract settlers. Mexico formally offered free land in exchange for those who would come and make a pledge to do two things: to become Mexican citizens, and number two, to become Roman Catholics. Already in this area were American settlers. Stephen F. Austin was one of the first so-called empresarios to bring American settlers, mostly from the South, into what came to be called Texas. And you can see here in the large oval, inside the orange oval, it says Austin's Colony that extends all the way down to Galveston Bay. And then in the upper, the smaller of the two, at the top, is a land grant made to Stephen F. Austin in 1827. So there were already colonies there because Mexico really didn't have the capacity to control these areas. Americans, mostly from the South, soon outnumbered Mexicans in the area, and they refused to become Catholics. The Mexican government, sensing the growing Americanness of the region, abolished slavery and restricted further immigration into the area. The reason Mexico abolished slavery was to prevent Americans from the South from coming in there and growing cotton and bringing slaves with them. So they abolished slavery. However, Americans under Sam Houston rebelled against Mexican rule in 1835. Mexican dictator Santa Anna tried to crush the rebellion, and despite impressive victories at the Alamo and Goliad, Santa Anna lost the decisive battle of San Jacinto in 1836. Therefore, Santa Anna was forced to sign a treaty setting the Texas boundary at the Rio Grande River, which guaranteed the independence of the Republic of Texas. So Texas then, in 1836, became an independent country, not a state. It became a country. So there were three countries in a row: Mexico, Texas, and the United States. But a country eventually became a state. At campaign rallies in 1844, Democratic presidential candidate James Polk urged Texas annexation, that it urged that Texas be brought in as a state. And he urged Oregon occupation under the concept of manifest destiny. And if you went to a Polk rally, you would see a flag like that on your screen on public display. And there's James Polk and the name of his running mate, George Dallas. And you can see in the field of blue, there are stars, each of which represents an existing state in the Union. And then outside of the blue is a single solitary lone star. That lone star represents Texas. And Polk promised to bring the lone star, Texas, into the Union, into the field with the other stars or the other states. And so Texas, the country of Texas, became a state in 1845. So Texas has the distinction of being the only country that decided to become a state in the United States of America. The Mexican-American War. President James Polk, once he was in the White House, desired not only annexation of Texas, but he wanted to annex California and New Mexico, which are approximately the area inside the red oval on the map, sometimes called, later came to be called the Mexican Cession, what Mexico ceded to the United States at the end of the war. President Polk wanted that area, and he was willing to go to war. President Polk was willing to go to war to get it. Whigs, workers, abolitionists, and many others opposed war, but expansionists supported President Polk. When the war broke out, Americans in California established the short-lived Bear Flag Republic. The U.S. Army occupied New Mexico, gaining support from the upper classes there. Ordinary Mexicans and Pueblo Indians resisted, but in the end, American military strength prevailed. Later, in 1879, former President Ulysses S. Grant made this statement that's on your screen to the right. President Grant said this: "I do not think there was ever a more wicked war than that waged by the United States on Mexico." The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed on February the 2nd, 1848, in a village of that name north of Mexico City, now part of Mexico City proper. By signing the treaty, ending the Mexican-American War, the United States gained permanent recognition of the Rio Grande as the Texas border, which you can see there with the red arrow. That's the Rio Grande, which goes from Brownsville at the Gulf all the way into northern New Mexico today. Plus, it took all of, in the war settlement, took all of Upper California and New Mexico, which is pretty much the area inside, not all of it, but pretty much the area inside the area inside the red oval there. Mexico, in exchange, received $15 million, and in 1853 received another $10 million for the Gadsden Purchase, a tract of land in southern Arizona and New Mexico. The price in lives was high also. 13,000 Americans lost their lives in this war, mostly to disease, and $97 million in military expenditures were made. Compromise with Britain in Oregon. The United States and Great Britain jointly occupied Oregon Territory or Oregon country. But the number of settlers, American settlers in the territory grew, and British interest declined when the fur trade started to diminish. Those settlers in Oregon by 1843 had a written constitution and elected a territorial legislature. So rather than go to war, the United States and Great Britain decided to conclude a treaty. The 1846 Oregon Treaty set the 49th parallel as the northern boundary of the United States, although Vancouver Island remained in British control. Now, there were British claims south of the 49th parallel and there were American claims north of there. So land commissions were set up to adjudicate and to work out those land claims and land swaps, but effectively, the country's northern border, at least most of the northern border, was set in 1846, and the southern border was set in 1848 at the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Point 3. Westward migration brings North and South into conflict over slavery. Where we stated that in the thesis statement at the outset. Westward migration brings North and South into conflict because the further west you go, slave owners want to know where they can set up slavery, and those who are against slavery want to know where they can restrict slavery from going. So the burning question then is, will slavery be permitted in the new territories? Will slavery be permitted specifically in the territories newly acquired from Mexico, also known as the Mexican Cession? Would slavery be allowed in the territories acquired from Mexico? Americans were very divided on this question. They disagreed vehemently. Many Americans said no, slavery should not be permitted in the Mexican Cession. But many more said yes, slavery should be permitted in the Mexican Cession. Those who said no supported an idea known as free soil. The Free Soilers believed that Congress could pass a law to prohibit the extension of slavery into the Mexican Cession. Free Soilers did not want slavery there because they believed that slavery was a moral wrong. They believed that it was an economic threat to free labor or wage labor. And they believed that slavery was what gave power to the southern states. Those who said yes, however, sometimes calling themselves the constitutionalists, believed that Congress did not have authority under the Constitution to stop slavery from entering the Mexican Cession. These pro-slavery supporters included Southerners who wanted new cotton lands and who wanted to protect their human property. So there's a standoff between an impasse between people who want slavery to go into the Mexican Cession and those who do not want it to go into the Mexican Cession. Disagreement between Free Soilers and pro-slavery forces over the extension of slavery into the Mexican Cession created a political standoff in the country. As the election of 1848 neared, many Americans began to support an idea called popular sovereignty, meaning that the issue of slavery in the territories in the Mexican Cession ought to be resolved by the territorial governments or the legislatures established by Congress to make laws for a particular territory. Popular means according to the people, sovereignty means rule. Excuse me. So the idea was that people who live in those territories could elect a legislative assembly, a legislature, and the legislature, acting on behalf of the people, could decide. This was called popular sovereignty. And popular sovereignty had a certain appeal to it because it appealed to the American democratic belief in self-government. But it was not a long-term solution. The Compromise of 1850. To strike a balance between the anti-slavery and pro-slavery forces in the country, the United States Congress passed the Compromise of 1850, which had several parts or elements to it. You can see here that Henry Clay is proposing the terms of the compromise in the US Congress. Under its terms, California entered the Union as a free state, the 31st state. But that would give California, that would give the free states 16 states, and the slave states would only have 15. And it would upset the equal balance in the US Senate between free states and slave states. But there was a bipartisan urgency to allow California to come in quickly. So the free state, the free soilers, the anti-slavery forces got California. But the pro-slavery forces got a promise that the territorial governments set up in the Mexican cession outside of California would be organized on the basis of popular sovereignty. That means, or that meant, that the other states to come out of that area, which would be Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico, that would mean that those 5 territories would be able to take a vote under their territorial legislature to decide whether or not they wanted to be free states or slave states. The slave states temporarily let California come in free, but the slave states were quite confident that under popular sovereignty, they could get 4 or maybe 5 of the remaining states to be slave states. So they gave up one in 1850 to get the other 5 later. That was their hope. In addition, the final element of the Compromise of 1850 was that a new fugitive slave law was passed, which was much more strict. The Compromise of 1850 did not solve the problem. It only delayed it. It delayed more serious sectional conflict and actually gave rise to increased abolitionism and sectionalism. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 offended Northerners because it denied a jury trial to alleged fugitives, and it forced all Northerners to assist in the act's enforcement if they were deputized. Frederick Douglass urged armed resistance to it. Other Northerners began to help and assist in the Underground Railroad, which helped slaves escape from the Upper South through the North into Canada. While some states even passed what were called personal liberty laws, which prohibited the use of state officials in the recovery of fugitive slaves. And on the right, you can see that a group of Black abolitionists has set up or posted around, around Boston, these posters warning fugitive slaves and free Blacks to watch out and not to talk to police officers and the watchmen, or the sort of like the government eyes. It says, for since the recent order of the mayor and aldermen, watchmen and police officers are empowered to act as kidnappers and slave catchers. And they have already been actually employed in kidnapping, catching, and keeping slaves. Therefore, if you value your liberty and the welfare of the fugitives among you, shun them in every possible manner, as so many hounds on the track of the most unfortunate of your race. Keep a sharp lookout for kidnappers and have top eye open. And notice the date, April 24th, 1851, not long after the Fugitive Slave Law became effective. abolitionist speeches, especially those by ex-slaves, aroused Northerners. But Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, probably did most, in the opinion of scholars, to create anti-slavery sentiment in the North by personalizing the institution, by bringing it close up where people could read it and experience it, as it were. On the left is Harriet Beecher Stowe, and on the right, Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Life Among the Lowly. In Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe depicted slavery's cruelty, its inhumanity, and destructive impact on families through the characters and a plot that appealed to the sentimentality of 19th century readers. There was little Eliza with a babe in arms, barely escaping across the icy Ohio River from a slave owner in hot pursuit and a pack of dogs. There was Uncle Tom, the noble and devout Christian. Financial necessity forces Tom's decent master to sell the kindly slave to Simon Legree, a vicious brute and sadist who had embraced slavery. Legree takes perverse delight in beating Tom until the old man dies. Uncle Tom's Cabin moved Northerners to tears and made slavery more personal to readers who had previously considered it only as a distant system of labor that exploited Black people. Later, Uncle Tom's Cabin was adapted for the stage, for screenplays. And here you can see a poster for what was called a Tom show. And it was in these shows that Uncle Tom was transformed from a kindly, dignified man into a fawning, servile man who wanted to please whites. Thus, the offensive term, Uncle Tom. Uncle Tom's Cabin infuriated white Southerners. They condemned it as a grossly false depiction of slavery and their way of life. They pointed out correctly that Harriet Beecher Stowe had little, if any, firsthand knowledge of slavery and had never even visited the Deep South. Although she lived in Cincinnati for 18 years and witnessed with anguish the desperate attempts of slaves to escape across the Ohio River. In response to her Southern critics, Stowe wrote a key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, citing the sources for her novel. Many of those sources were Southern newspapers. You can see inside the red circle, it says, presenting the original facts and documents upon which the story is founded, together with corroborative statements verifying the truth of the work. She hit the mark, for sure. The Kansas-Nebraska Act and growing concern over slavery's expansion in the middle of the 1850s. In 1854, US Senator Stephen Douglas from Illinois introduced a bill recommending that Kansas and Nebraska be organized on the basis of popular sovereignty. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska territories are inside the red oval. The bill's passage, the bill, if it were to pass, would have allowed slavery to exist in territories north of the 1820 Compromise line. Now you can see the red arrows there show the line, the Missouri Compromise line, dating all the way back to 1820. And according to that compromise, there could be no slavery north of the line, though there could be south of the line. That law, if it were to pass, would effectively put an end to the 34-year guarantee preventing slavery from going north of that line. Stephen Douglas did not support slavery's extension to Kansas and Nebraska, but he needed Southern support to route the transcontinental railroad through Chicago and develop the West generally. But the bill did pass, and the question of slavery in the territories was reopened. When Southern Whigs supported the bill, the Whig Party effectively disintegrated overnight, competing for Kansas. The Kansas-Nebraska Act opened the way for pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces to compete directly over whether or not Kansas would become a free state or a slave state. Pro-slavery settlers, like those shown in this drawing, came to Kansas from the slave state of Missouri next door to stake a claim to land and then to vote to turn Kansas into a slave state. Free soil settlers came to Kansas from many places and from as far away as Massachusetts. These settlers in this photograph are in Topeka, Kansas. You can see them arming themselves against their pro-slavery adversaries. So these individuals do not want slavery in Kansas, and they are preparing themselves for military conflict. Pro-slavery forces illegally won the election in March of 1855 to elect a territorial legislature. The pro-slavery side established a slave state government in Lecompton, where the blue oval is. Free soilers set up a free state government in Topeka, where the red circle is. And so you have two rival claimants, both of which asserts that it is the legitimate government and not the other. President Franklin Pierce did nothing, and both sides sent men to fight in Kansas. In May 1856, a pro-slavery mob attacked Lawrence, Kansas, inside the smaller green oval. 3 nights later, John Brown and his followers attacked a pro-slavery settlement at Pottawatomie Creek and hacked 5 men to death with swords. Violence even entered the halls of the US Congress. Northern abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner attacked pro-slavery leaders in a speech titled "The Crime Against Kansas." 2 days later, Southern Congressman Preston Brooks from South Carolina beat Sumner senseless with a cane as he sat at his Senate desk. These incidents set off a small civil war, not the Civil War, but a small one, in the summer of 1856, known as Bleeding Kansas. Deep differences between the North and South surface. The Dred Scott decision and its dreadful implications. In May 1846, these two distinguished Americans, Dred and Harriet Scott, filed a lawsuit in Missouri Federal Court, or Missouri Court, for their freedom, arguing that their masters had taken them into free territories. That lawsuit eventually reached the United States Supreme Court. In 1857, Chief Justice Roger Taney, on the left, on your screen, a descendant of Maryland's slaveholding elite, ruled for the Supreme Court in Dred Scott v. Sanford that blacks were not citizens of the United States nor of Missouri, thereby forcing Dred and Harriet Scott, along with their children, to remain in slavery. The dreadful implication for the United States was that the Supreme Court ruled the Missouri Compromise of 1820 to be unconstitutional because Congress, it said, did not have the power to ban slavery in a territory. Now that ruling was almost the last straw in the North, because it meant that slaveholders could take slaves and their institution into any territory. And there's but a small step between that right and a almost certain right to be granted later that they could take their slaves into free states, which meant that slaveholders and the slave power could not only take over the territories, but potentially could take over the entire country. If slavery were now permitted in all territories, even north of the 1820 line, might it be legal in northern states where it had been banned? The Dred Scott decision fed northern suspicions that the South planned to enslave all blacks in the United States, even in the northern states. And the Democratic Party was now deeply divided and weakened. Abraham Lincoln captures the leadership of the Republican Party. In debates with Democrat Stephen Douglas, the author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act for the 1858 Senate election in Illinois, Abraham Lincoln argued in the Lincoln-Douglas debates that slavery was a moral wrong, even though he admitted Republicans could not interfere with slavery where it already existed. Douglas was a white supremacist, and he strongly supported popular sovereignty in the territories. Lincoln did not win the 1858 Senate election, but he was able to portray the newly formed Republican Party as the only moral and political force capable of stopping the slave power. 2 years later, however, in 1860, Lincoln was elected president of the United States. John Brown at Harper's Ferry crystallized irreconcilable differences. The earliest image of John Brown on the left of your screen dates to about 1846 or early 1847. On October 16th, 1859, excuse me, after unsuccessfully trying to persuade Frederick Douglass to join him, John Brown, along with 22 interracial followers, attacked a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, a small town there, hoping to provoke a general slave uprising in the Upper South using the guns and ammunition that were stored in the arsenal. But federal troops overcame Brown and his men, although some, including at least one of Brown's sons named Orestes, managed to escape, although others were shot dead in the water. Brown himself was tried for treason and hanged. Many Northerners honored John Brown as a martyr and a Christian hero, and called for slave revolts in the South. Images like this on your screen, titled John Brown's Blessing, portrayed the abolitionist as an almost Christ-like beatific figure whose blessing on their children, slave mothers often saw it. But did John Brown kill in the name of God? John Brown, according to a written account by his half-brother, said, quote, John Brown said that he was a chosen instrument in the hands of God to war against slavery. In this controversial image, John Brown's hands are covered in blood. He has a Bible in one hand, a rifle in the other, and blood on both hands. So the question presents itself, how should historians and the general public and teachers assess the actions and historical legacy of those who kill in the name of God? Before 9/11, this was not as urgent a question, but now it is. And John Brown is undergoing what historians call a reappraisal, and his historical legacy is being modified as we speak. After John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, many in the South, especially when they saw and came to learn that John Brown's raiders were multiracial, many in the South decided that the North would do anything to stop slavery. And from that point forward, Southern Unionists lost their influence, and power increasingly was concentrated in the hands of those in the South favoring secession, or those who favored leaving the United States. Lincoln's election precipitates or causes Southern secession. I put up a timeline here to show the events of late 1860, early 1861. Lincoln is elected president in November 1860, but he didn't take office until March the 4th of 1861. Now today, since the Constitution was changed, presidents now take the oath of office in January, but at that time it was scheduled that the inauguration of the president was in March. So there's almost a 4-month gap there. Republicans expected that the South ultimately would accept Abraham Lincoln as president, but they were mistaken. South Carolina seceded from the Union on December the 20th, 1860, barely 6 weeks after Lincoln was elected. And as you can see on that overhead, or on the image on your screen, by February the 1st, 1861, 6 more states from the Deep South followed. That would be Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, Texas, Alabama, and Louisiana. On February the 18th, 1861, before Lincoln was even inaugurated as 16th president, Jefferson Davis, who's pictured on the right, took the oath of office on the balcony of the Capitol building in Montgomery, Alabama, as you can see in the photograph on the left. He took the oath of office as provisional president of the Confederate States of America. They adopted a constitution, and Jefferson Davis became president. The Confederate States of America was made up of first of 7 and then other states who left the United States and formed their own country over the issue of slavery. This flag is sometimes known as the Stars and the Bars. It is a later version of the official flag of the Confederate States of America, which underwent several changes. Some people today claim and believe that the flag stands for Southern culture, not slavery. But the Confederate States of America was founded on the institution of slavery, a principle surely exceeding in importance the other principles it claimed to believe in. In other words, slavery was the most important principle of the Confederate States of America. Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated as President of the United States on March the 4th, 1861. He opposed secession, and he opposed extension of slavery into the territories. He disagreed with the Dred Scott decision. In his inaugural address, Abraham Lincoln argued that the Union of the states was indivisible, that they can't break away. Lincoln notified the governor of South Carolina on April the 6th that he, Lincoln, was sending supplies and provision to Fort Sumter, a U.S. Army base inside South Carolina. But on April the 10th, Confederates demanded that Fort Sumter surrender, something that Lincoln was unwilling to consider or to do. On April the 12th, as Lincoln's relief expedition neared Charleston, South Carolina, Confederate batteries and guns began shelling Fort Sumter, and the Civil War had begun because the South, the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America attacked the Union. The irrepressible conflict. The Civil War lasted about 4 years, and we estimate that approximately 630,000 Americans lost their lives in the fighting. The Union armies of Lincoln over time took military actions to demoralize Southern citizens and to ruin the economy of the Confederacy, including the pulverization, reducing to dust Tredegar Iron Works in this photo, the crown jewel of the industrialized South. Sometimes called hard war or the hard hand of war. Slavery's expansion into the Western territories, wrote the venerable Gary Nash from UCLA, provoked a conflict between sections of the country that had long papered over their economic, cultural, political, and emotional differences. But slavery was fundamental to the conflict, the force that underlay all others. The Civil War smashed the slaveholding class in the United States, and eventually over 4 million enslaved African Americans were freed. This 1865 engraving, called Emancipation, shows scenes from slavery on the left side and scenes from freedom on the right. At the top, you see the children of Israel crossing the Red Sea, in an illustration of biblical emancipation through the power of God. In the center of all this is the family, the mainstay and pillar of African American life and culture. But after the Civil War, one newly freed slave said this: "Now we have freedom and nothing but freedom. Freedom is only the beginning. And for Black Americans, freedom is not yet complete, nor is it secure." I want to thank you for your attention, for your participation in the course. I hope this lecture was interesting. I hope it was informative. I hope it helps you understand our country's history and the reason why some problems still have not been resolved. And I encourage you to go back over the lecture if you have sections that you're not clear about. And as always, I encourage you to feel free to communicate with me in the different ways to try to clarify any questions you might have. Thank you very much. And again, I appreciate your attention. And my only regret about the course is that when it was online, I did not have the chance to meet each of you in person, but I encourage you to stay in communication with me. Thank you very much.